August 7th, 1942. The Solomon Islands hang in the Pacific like emeralds strung on invisible wire, each one dripping with heat and rain. On one of them, a half-finished airstrip cuts through the jungle at Lunga Point, its coral runway gleaming white against the green. Japanese engineers had been working there for weeks, hammering stakes, clearing kunai grass, building what Tokyo promised would be an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the heart of Allied waters. Then, at dawn, the horizon fills with ships. American Marines of the 1st Marine Division wade ashore through shallow surf, rifles held high, expecting resistance that never comes. The Japanese construction crews vanish into the jungle, leaving tools, rice bags, and blueprints scattered in the mud. Within hours, the Americans control the airfield. They rename it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway 2 months earlier. Tokyo receives the news like a slap. The island they considered secure, barely defended, a minor outpost in a vast empire, has been taken by an enemy they believed lacked the will to fight. The response is immediate and arrogant. Guadalcanal will be reclaimed within days, perhaps hours. The Americans are soft, their officers cautious, their soldiers unused to tropical warfare. One sharp night attack will send them fleeing back to their ships. This belief, repeated in staff meetings from Rabaul to Tokyo, becomes the first brick in a wall of delusion that will cost Japan 31,000 lives over the next 6 months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the Japanese High Command failed to understand was that Henderson Field had already changed the geometry of the Pacific. Every ship, every barge, every supply, run within 200 miles could now be attacked by American aircraft based on that narrow strip of coral. The island wasn't just land, it was a weapon, and whoever controlled it controlled the surrounding sea. By mid-August, the strategic picture looked deceptively simple on Japanese maps. Guadalcanal was a dot, lightly held, surrounded by waters Japan had dominated since Pearl Harbor. Reclaiming it required only courage and speed. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki embodied both, sharp-featured, impeccably uniformed, a veteran of campaigns in China where Japanese infantry had shattered larger forces through sheer aggression. Ichiki was chosen to lead the first counterattack. His orders were blunt: land east of the American perimeter, march through the jungle at night, and sweep the Marines into the sea before dawn. On August 18th, Ichiki's advance force, 916 men, slipped ashore from destroyers under cover of darkness. They moved silently through the humid blackness, bayonets fixed, convinced that shock and spirit would overwhelm any defense. Scouts pushed ahead through the dripping jungle, mapping wire, shallow foxholes, and a narrow river the Americans called the Tenaru, though its real name was Ilu. The intelligence reports Ichiki received painted a picture of disorder: no artillery flashes, no tank movements, no roar of engines, surely just a thin line of frightened men waiting to break. What Ichiki could not see, because his scouts never returned, was the other side of that river. Marine engineers had spent days turning the Tenaru's sandbar into a geometric trap. Browning M 1917 water-cooled machine guns sat in overlapping pairs, their barrels locked onto prearranged firing lanes. 37mm anti-tank guns were loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotguns filled with steel balls. Mortar crews had registered every approach, walking practice rounds across the far bank until the math was perfect. Range cards multiplied, fields of fire hardened. A natural crossing became an execution ground. Inside the Americans' perimeter, the mood was not confident, but prepared. Lieutenant Colonel Clifton Cates' 1st Marines and Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion had dug in deep. They knew the Japanese were coming. A patrol, led by Captain Charles Brush, had stumbled into Ichiki's scouts 2 days earlier, killing several and capturing documents that revealed the plan. General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the Marine Division, shifted reinforcements toward the river, tightening the net. The night of August 20th was moonless and suffocating. Humidity clung to skin like oil. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that sentries breathed through clenched teeth. Somewhere beyond the palms, Ichiki's column formed in silence. Swords were drawn, helmets tightened. The same phrase whispered down the line that had carried them through China. Spirit conquers steel. At 2 a.m, they charged. The sandbar erupted in fire. Red tracers sliced through the darkness in perfect, lethal geometry. The Brownings roared without pause, steam hissing from their water jackets as crews poured liquid into boiling sleeves. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder that drowned out screams. Japanese soldiers running across the open sand were cut down in waves, their bodies tumbling into shallow water that turned black under the moon. Ichiki's men did not retreat. They charged again and again. Grenades arced through the air. Bayonets flashed in the muzzle flashes. For brief, savage moments, Marines and Japanese soldiers grappled hand to hand in the mud, slipping on blood and shredded vegetation. But every assault dissolved under the relentless rhythm of coordinated American fire. Machine gunners shouted corrections through the chaos. Mortar rounds walked across the riverbank with terrifying precision. The 37mm guns fired canister in steady, booming intervals, each blast shredding men like paper. By 4 a.m, the attacks had stopped. The sandbar was carpeted with bodies. Weapons floated in the surf. At dawn, 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across the river, hunting survivors through coconut groves. They fired canister shells into thickets where wounded Japanese soldiers lay hidden, unable to move, unwilling to surrender. The slaughter continued until there was nothing left to kill. Of Ichiki's 916 men, more than 800 were dead. The colonel himself lay among them, his sword beside his body, a bullet through his chest. American losses, 44 killed. The myth of Japanese invincibility, built on victories from Manchuria to the Philippines, had met its first true crack in the mud of the Tenaru River. But in Tokyo, the defeat was dismissed as bad luck, poor timing, insufficient numbers. Reinforcements would correct the mistake. Faith in spirit over systems remained unshaken. What Japan failed to grasp was that the Tenaru was not an anomaly, it was a preview. The Americans had not won, through luck or superior courage. They had won through coordination, preparation, and an industrial system that could replace every bullet fired, every barrel worn out, every man lost. The Japanese had brought their best. The Marines had brought mathematics. By late August, the Tokyo Express was running at full speed. Fast destroyers, sleek and lethal, roared down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, under cover of darkness. They carried men, not cargo. Each ship could deliver a few hundred soldiers to Guadalcanal's beaches before vanishing into the night, but they could not bring the weight of war. No heavy artillery, no tanks, no bulk fuel or medical supplies. What arrived were riflemen with courage and empty stomachs. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's brigade, 6,500 men, landed east of Henderson Field in early September. They came believing the next assault would succeed where Ichiki had failed. This time, there would be no frontal charge across, an open sandbar. Instead, they would move through the jungle, infiltrate the ridges south of the airfield, and strike from the high ground under cover of night. It was a smarter plan, more sophisticated, and it would fail just as completely. The Americans, meanwhile, had not been idle. Henderson Field was no longer a captured prize. It was a functioning airbase. Grumman 4F Wildcat fighters and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers took off daily, hunting Japanese ships, barges, and convoys. Pilots landed on dirt runways still wet from rain, refueled from hand-pumped barrels, and launched again before the mud dried. They slept in foxholes beside their planes, listening to the drone of Japanese bombers that came nightly but rarely hit anything vital. The Cactus Air Force, as it became known, owned the daylight. Every Japanese destroyer run that lingered past dawn risked annihilation. Pilots returned with stories of burning ships, lifeboats scattered across the water, and the oil slicks that marked another failed resupply. On the ground, Marines watched the smoke trails and counted. Each sinking meant fewer supplies for the enemy. Each dawn meant another day holding the airfield. But the jungle was filling again. Kawaguchi's men moved silently through the interior, cutting trails with machetes, hauling ammunition and rice on their backs. They studied crude maps, sharpened bayonets on stones, and whispered about the coming victory. The ridge south of Henderson Field rose like a spine, narrow and steep, flanked by ravines so deep they swallowed sound. If they could seize it, the airfield would fall within hours. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, had already walked that ridge. He knew exactly what was coming. His men, 840 raiders and parachutists, dug in along the crest. Machine guns were positioned to interlock fields of fire. Mortars were zeroed on every approach. Artillery batteries, the 11-inch guns, of the 11th Marines, precited coordinates so tight they could drop shells within yards of friendly positions. There was no fallback plan, just a single line meant to hold until nothing was left to hold with. September 12th. The jungle pulsed with insect noise and humidity. Kawaguchi's force, nearly 3,000 men, moved through the ravines in silence. Their objective was clear: take the ridge, destroy the airfield, prove that Japan's warriors could not be stopped by a strip of coral and a few hundred exhausted Marines. At dusk, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder, turning the ridge into slick mud. Then came the sound. Whispers rising into shouts, branches snapping, the rhythmic thud of boots on wet earth. The first wave hit like a landslide. Flares turned night into day. Marines fired until their barrels glowed red, until brass casings piled around their boots, until their hands blistered from heat and recoil. The Japanese came in waves. Some crawled through the grass. Others screamed as they charged uphill, bayonets fixed, faces lit by muzzle flashes. When positions were overrun, raiders counterattacked with knives, pistols, entrenching tools, fists. Sergeant John Basilone, positioned behind a heavy Browning, kept his weapon firing alone after both gun crews were killed. He cleared jams by hand, loaded belts in the dark, and held his section of the line while enemy soldiers closed to within yards. By dawn on September 13th, the ridge was a wasteland. Bodies lay tangled in the undergrowth. Shattered equipment littered the slopes. Edson walked the line, his face grey with exhaustion, checking on men who could barely lift their rifles. They had held, but the cost had been savage. That night, Kawaguchi came again, stronger, more desperate. Both flanks of the ridge erupted simultaneously. Japanese infantry surged upward in human waves, accepting casualties that would have broken any other force. Marines fought until weapons melted, until ammunition ran so low they were rationing single rounds. Artillery fire fell so close that shrapnel wounded Marines and Japanese alike. The night became a blur of explosions, screams, and the stuttering roar of machine guns that refused to stop. When daylight broke on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive was finished. His force had disintegrated. Hundreds of his men lay dead in the ravines. The survivors melted back into the jungle, starving, diseased, broken. The Marines called it Bloody Ridge. Japan called it impossible. Both were right. The defeat shattered more than Kawaguchi's brigade. It shattered the belief that courage alone could overcome systems. The Americans had not just fought bravely, they had fought smart. Every bullet, every shell, every mortar round had been part of a coordinated machine. Japanese soldiers carried spirit. American Marines carried radios. In the aftermath, both sides paused. The Japanese to rebuild, to plan another assault, to convince themselves that the next attack would succeed. The Americans to reinforce, to dig deeper, to prepare for what they knew was coming. Because Guadalcanal had become more than a battle, it had become a test, a question asked in blood and fire. Could Japan's warrior ethos defeat America's industrial war machine? The answer was being written in the mud, one body at a time. By late September, the contrast between the two armies had become undeniable to anyone willing to see it. The Americans were not fighting harder. They were fighting smarter. Guadalcanal had become a proving ground for a new kind of warfare, one where coordination mattered more than courage, where supply lines determined survival, and where every element of combat, air, artillery, infantry, and logistics functioned as a single organism. Henderson Field hummed day and night. Aircraft landed, refueled, and launched in continuous cycles. Pilots knew that at any moment they could call for support from the 11th Marines' artillery batteries, from naval gunfire offshore, or from fellow pilots circling above. Forward observers crouched in foxholes with radios, relaying coordinates to gun crews who could drop high-explosive shells within 100 yards of friendly lines in minutes. The system worked because it had been designed to work, tested, refined, and drilled until it became instinct. The Japanese had courage in terrifying abundance. But courage could not replace radio networks. It could not conjure fuel depots or spare parts. It could not turn scattered battalions into a unified force. Japanese artillery fired sporadically because shells were rationed like gold. Machine guns overheated and fell silent because cooling water was scarce. Mortars sat unused because crews had no way to coordinate fire with infantry attacks. Every assault was brave, every assault was isolated. American firepower was heavier, but more importantly, it was synchronized. Marine mortar teams could shift fire by degrees as enemy movements changed. Heavy Browning machine guns kept firing because ammunition arrived by the ton, carried by men who understood exactly what depended on their work. Water for cooling jackets flowed steadily. Barrels were swapped when they wore out. The system fed itself. On the Japanese side, supply meant improvisation. Soldiers stripped ammunition from the dead. They melted, scavenged lead to make bullets. They carried rice in helmets and boiled roots when the rice ran out. Officers planned attacks based not on what was needed, but on what was available. When a Type 96 machine gun's barrel warped from overheating, it stayed warped. There were no replacements. By October, American engineers had transformed Guadalcanal's beachhead into an operating base. Roads cut through swamps. The runway at Henderson Field had been extended. Fuel tanks built from salvaged oil drums dotted the perimeter. Field hospitals treated malaria and wounds with medicine that arrived on schedule. Spare parts for aircraft, vehicles, and weapons flowed in on cargo ships protected by destroyers and air cover. Japanese commanders, still clinging to the myth of spiritual superiority, continued to plan offensives based on will rather than capacity. They had no understanding of redundancy, no backup generators, no secondary supply routes, no replacement equipment. When something broke, it stayed broken. The gap widened with every engagement. A Marine squad that lost a machine gun could have it replaced within hours. A Japanese platoon that lost theirs often finished the campaign fighting with bayonets and grenades. The technological disparity was less about individual weapons and more about the invisible systems that kept those weapons functioning. Logistics, maintenance, communication, organization. One Japanese officer, captured later in the campaign, described it in his interrogation. "We never imagined an enemy could coordinate air, artillery, and infantry so quickly, so perfectly. It was like fighting a machine that never slept, never stopped, never ran out of anything." The Americans were not superhuman. They were systematic. And in modern war, systems outlasted courage every single time. The lessons were written in blood on both sides, but only one side was learning them. Japan kept sending men. America kept building machines, and on Guadalcanal, the machines were winning. By October 1942, Tokyo had run out of patience and excuses. 2 failed offensives, thousands of dead, and an American airfield that grew stronger by the day. The answer, as always, was more force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself ordered a final, decisive blow to reclaim Guadalcanal. This would not be another piecemeal attack. This would be overwhelming. Troops poured in from across the shrinking empire. Veterans from China, survivors from New Guinea, fresh conscripts told they were marching toward glory. Artillery pieces were finally brought ashore, dragged through the jungle by exhausted men. A handful of Type 97 medium tanks, Japan's closest answer to armoured warfare, landed on the beaches. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was desperation wrapped in steel. The plan was ambitious, a multi-pronged assault that would strike from both west and south simultaneously, crushing the American perimeter and seizing Henderson Field before reinforcements could arrive. The western thrust would cross the Matanikau River with tank support, smashing through marine defences. The southern force, led by Major General Yumio Nasu, would swing through the jungle hills with 6,000 men, hitting the Americans from behind in a coordinated night attack. It was the largest Japanese ground offensive of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. For many of the soldiers involved, it would also be their last. October 23rd. Rain hammered the jungle as the offensive began. The western attack across the Matanikau launched first. 9 Type 97 tanks, their steel hulls gleaming wet, rumbled toward the river with infantry jogging behind. It was supposed to be a breakthrough, a demonstration of Japanese firepower that would shatter American morale. It lasted minutes. Marine anti-tank guns, 37mm pieces crewed by men who had been drilling for exactly this moment, opened fire at point-blank range. The first tank exploded, its turret spinning into the air. The second caught fire, crew scrambling out only to be cut down by machine gun fire. One by one, the tanks were destroyed, reduced to burning wrecks that blocked the river crossing. Artillery from the 11th Marines rained down on the infantry behind them. The attack dissolved into chaos. Survivors scattered into the jungle, leaving the tanks to smoulder like funeral pyres. The southern assault, Nasu's force, was Japan's real hope. They moved through the darkness with discipline born of desperation, navigating ravines and ridges in near-total silence. Ahead of them, dug in along the same bloody ground where Kawaguchi had failed, were Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced by the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. The Americans were waiting. The first Japanese wave emerged from the jungle just after midnight. Flares burst overhead, turning the darkness into flickering daylight. Machine guns opened fire in coordinated bursts, their tracers crisscrossing the killing ground. Japanese soldiers charged uphill into the teeth of it, bayonets fixed, voices rising in battle cries that were swallowed by the roar of gunfire. For hours, the attacks came in relentless waves, each one slightly different, probing for weakness, searching for a gap in the American line. Marines fired until their weapons glowed red, until ammunition belts ran low, until their hands bled from heat and friction. Runners crawled through shellfire, dragging fresh ammunition boxes to gun positions that could not afford to go silent. Chesty Puller moved along the line under fire, his voice cutting through the chaos. He kicked sleeping men awake, shoved ammunition into trembling hands, and shouted orders that kept the defense from collapsing. When a gap opened, he filled it with cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle. The line bent, but never broke. Sergeant John Basilone, already legendary from Bloody Ridge, once again became the hinge of survival. When both his machine gun crews were killed, he fought alone, clearing jams with his bare hands, loading belts in the dark, holding his section of the line while Japanese soldiers closed to within feet. His weapon never stopped firing. His position never fell. By dawn on October 25th, the jungle was silent except for the moaning of the wounded. General Nasu's offensive had shattered against American steel and coordination. The general himself was dead, cut down by machine gun fire during one of the final assaults. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay motionless in the ravines and undergrowth. American casualties were heavy, several hundred killed or wounded, but survivable. Henderson Field remained untouched, its runway intact, its aircraft still flying. The offensive that was supposed to turn the tide had instead sealed Japan's fate on Guadalcanal. Tokyo had thrown its best men, its limited armour, its carefully hoarded artillery, and watched them disappear into the jungle's maw. What came next would be decided not on land, but across the black, restless waters surrounding the island. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The seas around Guadalcanal had always been dangerous, but in mid-November 1942 they became apocalyptic. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a brawl, chaotic and brutal, fought at ranges so close that searchlights illuminated the faces of dying men. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, spanning 3 days from November 12th to 15th, would determine who owned the island and, by extension, who owned the future. On the night of November 12th, a Japanese bombardment force charged toward Henderson Field. Leading them were 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, massive vessels whose 14-inch guns could reduce the airfield to rubble. Their mission was simple: obliterate the runway, destroy the planes, and clear the way for troop transports waiting beyond the horizon. Waiting for them in the darkness was an American force commanded by Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott. 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, outnumbered and outgunned, but determined to stop the bombardment at any cost. The 2 fleets collided just after midnight in a maelstrom of confusion. Searchlights stabbed through the rain and smoke. Ships fired at point-blank range, their muzzle flashes lighting up the water like strobe lights. The destroyer Cushing opened fire first, her 5-inch guns hammering at shadows. Within moments, the entire formation dissolved into individual duels. Ship against ship, gun against gun, men screaming orders that no one could hear over the thunder. Admiral Callahan was killed on the bridge of his flagship, the cruiser San Francisco, when a Japanese shell tore through the superstructure. Admiral Scott died moments later aboard the cruiser Atlanta, his ship crippled and burning. American destroyers charged into the melee like wolves, firing torpedoes at battleships they could barely see. Some hit, most missed. The water churned with explosions and sinking steel. By dawn, both sides had been mauled. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, but the Japanese bombardment had failed. Hiei, crippled and burning, limped away from the battle, only to be finished off by aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise. Her crew abandoned ship as flames, consumed her from within. She sank in the afternoon, taking hundreds of sailors with her. The sacrifice of Callahan's force had bought time, but the battle was far from over. On the night of November 14th, Kirishima tried again. This time, the Americans were ready. The battleship Washington, equipped with radar that could see through darkness and rain, positioned herself in Kirishima's path. At just after 11 p.m., Washington's guns spoke. 9 16-inch shells, each weighing more than a ton, slammed into Kirishima at near point-blank range. The impacts were catastrophic. Armor plate peeled away like tin foil. Internal compartments exploded. Fires erupted across her decks, turning the battleship into a floating inferno. Within minutes, Kirishima was dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship as she rolled and capsized. She sank before dawn, taking over 500 men with her. For Japan, the loss of 2 battleships in 3 days was a wound from which the Navy would never recover. Capital ships, the symbols of naval power, could not be replaced quickly. Each one lost was a year of construction, thousands of tons of steel, and the trained crews who knew how to fight them. But the real catastrophe came in the wake of that naval battle. Japan had attempted to push a massive reinforcement convoy toward Guadalcanal. 11 transport ships carrying the 38th Division, thousands of troops, artillery, vehicles, and enough supplies to sustain a renewed offensive. They never made it. Henderson Field's bombers, unleashed in the daylight, turned the convoy into a massacre. American dive bombers and torpedo planes swarmed the transports like hornets, dropping their payloads with terrifying precision. Ships exploded. Fuel tanks ignited. Men leaped into the water, some burning, others drowning under the weight of their equipment. Naval gunfire from American cruisers finished what the aircraft started. By the time the attack ended, only 4 transports, it had reached Guadalcanal's beaches. Those 4 were destroyed before their cargo could be fully unloaded. Nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, burned, or were killed before they ever set foot on the island. Equipment sank to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water that had claimed so many ships it earned its name in steel and blood. The few survivors who made it ashore carried little more than rifles and the clothes on their backs. They dug shallow foxholes in the sand and waited for supplies that would never arrive. Meanwhile, offshore, American sailors watched the horizon glow orange with burning ships. Pilots at Henderson Field toasted their survival with coffee brewed from rainwater, laughing over wreckage that still smouldered just beyond the runway. The naval battle of Guadalcanal had broken Japan's ability to wage sustained war around the island. The empire had thrown its last punch and missed. The ocean, once Japan's highway to conquest, had become its graveyard, and on land, the men left behind were about to face an enemy far worse than bullets. By December 1942, Guadalcanal had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a slow execution. The Japanese soldiers still alive on the island were no longer fighting Americans. They were fighting starvation, disease, and the jungle itself. The once proud 17th Army, which had landed with confidence and dreams of victory, was now a skeletal force clinging to survival in the mud. Food was gone. Rice rations, already meagre, had dwindled to a few grains per man per day. Soldiers chewed grass, boiled tree bark, and dug for roots that left them sick and weaker. Some ate insects, snails, anything that moved. Others gnawed on leather belts and bootstraps, trying to extract nutrients that did not exist. One officer wrote in his diary, "We no longer discuss tactics, we discuss whether it is better to die of hunger or disease." Malaria swept through the camps like wildfire. Men shivered with fever in the tropical heat, their bodies burning from within. Dysentery followed, turning men into hollow shells who could barely stand. Tropical ulcers, festering wounds that ate through flesh down to the bone, became commonplace. Medical supplies had run out weeks earlier. There were no bandages, no antiseptics, no painkillers. Soldiers died quietly in their foxholes, their names unrecorded, their bodies left to rot where they fell. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against them. Torrential rains flooded tunnels and washed away food caches. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick that men covered their faces just to breathe. The mud was everywhere, clinging, suffocating, inescapable. Rifles rusted, uniforms rotted. Men who had once marched with pride now shuffled like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken. On the American side, life was difficult but manageable. Supply convoys arrived regularly, protected by Henderson's aircraft and naval escorts. Marines received rations, fresh water, medical care, and rest rotations. Divisions rotated in and out, replacing exhausted men with fresh troops. Equipment was maintained, weapons cleaned, ammunition stockpiled. The machine kept running. The contrast was unbearable for those Japanese soldiers still conscious enough to notice. American planes flew overhead daily, unchallenged. The sound of engines, once a sign of danger, became a reminder of hopelessness. Every convoy that arrived meant more American strength. Every day that passed meant more Japanese death. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding from Rabaul, sent desperate messages to Tokyo. Guadalcanal was lost. The men there were dying. Evacuation was the only option. For weeks, Tokyo refused to acknowledge reality. Admitting defeat was unthinkable. The emperor's soldiers did not retreat. They fought to the last man, died with honor, became examples for future generations. But even Tokyo could not ignore the numbers. Of the 36,000 Japanese soldiers who had served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 15,000 were still alive by January 1943. Most of those survivors were too sick or starved to fight. Battalions had been reduced to a few dozen men. Companies existed only on paper. The army that had vowed to reclaim the island had decayed into a starving remnant. In early February, Tokyo finally authorized Operation KE, evacuation. It was a word whispered in shame, a decision that broke the hearts of commanders who had believed in ultimate victory, but it was the only choice left. Fast destroyers, the same ships that had carried men to Guadalcanal with such hope, would now carry the survivors away. The operation began on the night of February 1st, 1943. Destroyers slipped into the waters off Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, their crews tense, expecting American attacks that never came. The Americans, focused on what they believed was another resupply run, did not interfere. Japanese soldiers, too weak to march, were carried to the beaches on stretchers or crawled there on their hands and knees. Over 3 nights, approximately 11,000 men were evacuated, hollow-eyed, skeletal, many weighing less than 90 pounds. They boarded destroyers in silence, leaving behind the bodies of 25,000 comrades who had not survived. The jungle swallowed the remains. The airfield stood untouched. The island that was supposed to fall in days had consumed an army in 6 months. On February 9th, General Alexander Patch, now commanding American forces on Guadalcanal, sent a message to Admiral William Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. Japan had lost its first major ground defeat of the war. More importantly, it had lost the illusion that courage could overcome industrial power. The Japanese survivors would never forget what they had seen on Guadalcanal. The constant drone of American aircraft, the endless flow of supplies. The artillery that answered every call within minutes. They had witnessed an enemy whose strength never ran dry, whose systems never collapsed, whose machines never stopped. It was a nightmare that would follow them through every subsequent battle of the war. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with Japan and win, not through luck, not through desperation, but through organization, logistics, and the relentless application of industrial might. The lessons learned there about coordination, supply chains, and combined arms warfare would be refined and applied across the Pacific. From Tarawa to Okinawa, the American war machine would only grow more efficient, more devastating, more unstoppable. Japan, meanwhile, would never recover. The 17th Army, once a proud force, was shattered beyond repair. The Navy had lost 2 battleships, multiple cruisers, destroyers, and thousands of irreplaceable sailors. The air forces stationed at Rabaul, the fortress that was supposed to support Guadalcanal, had been bled dry trying to reinforce an island that could not be saved. Pilots, aircraft, fuel, all consumed in a futile effort to reverse the irreversible. What happened on Guadalcanal was not just a military defeat, it was a revelation. Japan had entered the war believing that spirit, discipline, and the warrior's code would overcome any material disadvantage. The myth of Bushido, the way of the warrior, had carried them through China, through Southeast Asia, through the early months of the Pacific War. But on Guadalcanal, that myth collided with a different kind of enemy. An enemy that did not rely on individual heroism, but on collective efficiency. An enemy that replaced casualties faster than they could be inflicted. An enemy whose supply lines stretched across an ocean but never broke. An enemy that turned war into mathematics and won every equation. The Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal carried that knowledge with them. They knew, even if their commanders refused to admit it, that the war was already lost. Not lost in February 1943 when they evacuated, lost in August 1942 when they failed to understand what Henderson Field represented, lost the moment they believed courage alone would be enough. One Japanese veteran, years later, wrote a single haunting line in his memoir: "We did not lose to the Americans, we lost to the future." He was right. Guadalcanal was not a battle between armies. It was a collision between 2 philosophies of war, one rooted in honor, tradition, and the strength of the individual warrior, the other rooted in industry, logistics, and the power of coordinated systems. Japan's soldiers were among the bravest the world has ever seen. They charged into machine gun fire without hesitation. They fought to the death rather than surrender. They endured starvation and disease with stoic resolve. But bravery could not feed an army. Discipline could not replace ammunition. Honor could not stop a bullet, heal a wound, or fly an airplane without fuel. The Americans understood something fundamental that Japan never grasped until it was too late. Modern war was not won by heroes. It was won by supply clerks, radio operators, mechanics, engineers, and logistics officers. The men who ensured that every bullet reached the front, every aircraft had fuel, every wounded Marine received medical care. The invisible army that kept the machine running. Guadalcanal was the first place where that truth became undeniable. The myth of the invincible Japanese warrior drowned in the humid jungles of the Solomon Islands, replaced by the cold, merciless efficiency of industrial warfare. From that moment forward, every Japanese offensive would fail not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their nation lacked the capacity to sustain them. The empire fought on for 3 more years, from island to island, from Tarawa to Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Every battle saw the same pattern. Japanese soldiers fighting with desperate bravery against American forces backed by overwhelming firepower and endless supplies. Every battle ended the same way. Japan lost. 31,000 Japanese soldiers died on Guadalcanal over 6 months. Most did not die in glorious charges or heroic last stands. They died of starvation, disease, and neglect. They died because their commanders sent them into battle without the tools to win. They died because their nation believed spirit could replace steel. Today, the jungle has reclaimed most of what remains. Rusted machine guns lie half buried in the mud. Helmets hang from tree branches, empty and forgotten. The airfield, Henderson Field, is still there, now an international airport serving the Solomon Islands. Jets land where Marines once slept in foxholes, where Japanese soldiers once charged to their deaths. On both sides of the island, memorials stand in quiet. Remembrance. American flags wave over marble monuments listing the names of Marines who never came home. Japanese shrines mark the places where thousands fell, their remains still scattered through the jungle. The descendants of those who fought visit sometimes, elderly men with tears in their eyes, paying respects to ghosts that never left. But the real monument to Guadalcanal is not carved in stone. It is written in the history that followed. Japan learned too late that modern war demands more than courage. It demands logistics, industry, coordination, and the capacity to sustain those systems under pressure. America learned that it could project power across an ocean, build bases in hostile jungles, and turn captured ground into weapons of war. Guadalcanal decided more than the fate of one island. It decided the future of the Pacific. It proved that the age of the warrior had ended, replaced by the age of the machine, and it demonstrated, in blood and fire and starvation, that no amount of spirit can overcome a nation that masters the systems of war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.